as I mentioned, the second panel will be dedicated to Ani's memory in Armenian culture and diaspora. And our special guest is architect Dr. Virgil Pop, who will address some thoughts after the three lectures of Dr. Balint Kovács, Karen Nyalatian, and Vahe Tashian. So please, Kovács Balint, Tanár úr, head of the Department of Armenology at the Pázmány Péter Catholic University, to keep his lecture. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for us, and thank you for the Matthias Corvinus Collegium for this very nice invitation, and especially my friend and colleague Dr. Attila Konz, who was the initiator of this event. And so today we discuss the memory of Ani, actually, and it's very strongly connected also to Transylvania, to the Armenians in Transylvania, especially in Hayakarak, Szamosújvár, Gerla, or in Armenian also Kerla, sometimes in the sources. So this is also the title of my presentation, the Ani-Armenians in Transylvania. The people with a long written tradition, as the Armenians, they enjoy a rich repertoire of symbols, legends, and historical accounts with which a modern national consciousness can be constructed. A people's consciousness of their origin and derivation is more often than not just devoid to factual historical sources. They rely on myths, legends of Genesis as well. In the 19th century, a big group of Armenians in different places in the world, but also in East Central Europe, as in Transylvania, defined themselves as Ani-Armenians. It means an Armenian whose family originally was from the capital of the Bagratuni dynasty. Ani, which was occupied through the Seljuk invasion, and later it was destroyed. For example, the Armenians in Nornahichevan in the 19th century defined also themselves as Ani-Armenians, and they undertook pilgrimages to Ani from their homeland. So which means Ani, as a historical city, was several times also in the focus of scientific researches, especially archaeological excavations. And from other side, also Ani was important in the scholarship, but Ani as a lieu du mémoire, as a symbol, was only in a few cases discussed. In my hypothesis, Ani was a lieu du mémoire for the Armenians in Transylvania in the sense of Pierre Nora's definition. Pierre Nora was the scholar who done this definition or done this concept, lieu du mémoire. As Pierre Nora explains, and I'm citing, our interest in lieu du mémoire, where memory crystallizes and secrets itself, has occurred at a particular historical moment, a turning point where consciousness of a break with the past is bound up with the sense that memory has been turned in such a way as to pose the problem of the embodiment of memory in certain sites where a sense of historical continuity persists. There are lieu du mémoire, sites of memory, or in Hungarian, emlékezeti hely, because there are no longer milieu du mémoire, real environments of memory. In my paper, I don't want to focus on the history of the capital of Ani, but much more I would like to show how developed from a real place, a symbol, how became the old capital as a real capital, a lieu du mémoire for the Armenians, particularly for the Armenians in Transylvania. First of all, we need to highlight that Ani had a status. It was not just the city, it was not just the capital, but it was the capital of the Armenian Kingdom. It means that the belonging to Ani was not just the general belonging to the historically homeland, but to the connection to the homeland, which was somehow connected to the medieval history of the Armenians. It means also that Ani symbolized the state, yeah, not only the town. It was only through a capital, and this was not just the place of the emperor, of the Armenian emperor, but it was the place of the Armenian aristocrats as well. One of the central issues in the Armenian collective memory is the memory of this kingdom, of this Bagratid kingdom, which means that the belonging to Ani was also through this capital, through the Bagratid kingdom possible. And this explanation was kept alive throughout, inspiring the national pride of the Armenians for many centuries after the demolition of this capital. And as I mentioned, that Armenians in different places, I mean not just in Transylvania, but in Poland, in Galicia as well, they were very proud on their ancestors, as Levon Alishan in the 19th century, like Armenian scholar, formulated, to tell you a couple of more things about the Armenians living in Lviv. They are proud and well organized because they are Ani-Armenians. Ani, from its destruction, I mean through centuries, was an important place in the Armenian imagination. Also in the 18th century, Ani played a substantial role in the political economic plan between Russia and Armenia. For example, Hovsef Arutyan, the Armenian archbishop who served also, not just as a religious leader of the Armenians in the Russian Empire, but he became for 1 year the Catholicos of all Armenians, because after the elections, within 1 year he died. But he suggested Ani or Vahar Shapat for a future Armenian capital. And Ani had like the importance for him as well. And if we can see for so here is Ani. I guess if you see, very close, it's in Turkey, and I guess it was discussed already today. But here the next person whom I would like to mention is Çanik Aramian, who created the concept of the Armenian mother, yeah? And this Armenian mother somehow symbolized the whole entire nation. And in 1861, he published a poster in Paris where the illustration depicts the ruins of Ani, which were associated to the motherland of the Armenians. And it's interesting that on this picture, if you can see, so this is a huge placard, yeah? And there is Ani in the little ruin, but it's not only Ani, but also the main elements of the Armenian history are in this poster. And later this print became very popular, yeah? It was reproduced in variety of forms, sizes, and used to decorate the homes of many Armenian families. And it was also the kind of promotion of the national identity, or was important for the promotion of the national identity. And what we can see here on the picture, it is in Budapest, in the Armenian Catholic Church, and it's written that the symbols of Armenia, we can see here the mother of Armenia, how she is sitting very sad on the ruins of the historical Armenia. Left of the mother, we can see Ani, Karin, Van, which are places in Western Armenia, today in Turkey. And right side of the mother, we can see the names of some other old capitals, Artashat, Vahar, Shapat, Armavir, Dvin, and also we can see Nakhichevan, which is the part of Azerbaijan today as well. And this graphic became also the symbol, and I can show you, here are the other capitals and towns. This became the symbol of the Armenian collectiveness in Budapest. In the 30s, what we can see, there is a group photo of the Armenians in Budapest, not only Transylvanian Armenians, but also Armenians who settled after the Armenian genocide in Budapest. And on the photo is not only the flag of the Armenian Republic, but also and other flag, the Greek flag, but also the graphic, which shows the unity of the Armenians. And I guess it's an important symbol for the, or it was an important symbol for the Armenians in Budapest. So with other words, until the turn of the 18th, 19th century, Ani was a magical symbol also for political concepts. And from other side, Ani also emerged as a scientific place of interest for researchers. And for example, here we can see this in the case of Nicolas Marr, who made an archaeological excavation in Ani, and with his colleagues, he had a huge plan for Ani, restoring the cathedral, like creating parks and opening a school to educate children. With other words, what we can see that, as these words are from Claude Mutafian, that Ani was a kind of phoenix, which was again and again was an all-important hub of Armenian culture, tradition, and history. Then we can see a monk, Armenian monk, Minas Bzezskeans, who was a militarist from Venice, and he published in 1830 a very long, I would say like a very huge travel account, which is like this Chanaparhodutsun in Lehastan, so the travels to Poland and to other countries where Ani-Armenians are living. So he was member of the militarist congregation in Venice, and he was one of the monks who were, discussing in a scholarly way the Armenian history, culture, and who reconstructed, or even we can say that they constructed the history of the Armenians. And the previous scholar, Nicolas Marr, wrote about Bzezskeans' travel account, and I'm citing now Marr. All things merge here within the realm of reality that the Armenian sources have ever said about the city. Bzezskeans did not see Ani, and yet it seems that the power of Ani is forcible, and is it not only works upon those who have seen the ruins, but also upon one's imagination. Bzezskeans traveled firstly in 1808 to Central and Eastern Europe, including Hungary, Transylvania, Galicia, and Bulgaria, and Crimea, Moldova. He made notices everywhere about every little village, every little city where he met Armenians, and he told, "You are from Ani, you are Ani-Armenians." In his travel document, he never made an argument that why you are Ani-Armenian. But he's an a family from, for example, Kézdivásárhely, or Sepsiszentgyörgy, or Brassó, not only in Gerla and in the, but everywhere where he met an Armenian merchant, you are from Ani. And I guess this is important for us today, because on the basis of historical evidence, we don't have anything which is telling that the Armenians in Transylvania are a homogeneous Ani-Armenian group. We have Simeon Lehaci. Simeon Lehaci is writing a couple of hundred years before that the Armenians in Lviv, they are speaking different Armenians, and one group of them is telling that, we are from Ani. But also Simeon Lehaci is writing in the form that the Armenians are telling, So, and it is also not in Transylvania, so it's much earlier, But about Transylvania, we don't have no evidence about. And actually, that it's also difficult to imagine that Armenian group, along their migration route from Ani to Transylvania, it's approximately 7 or 8 centuries, yeah, that they can keep themselves as a homogeneous Ani-Armenian group, which is clear, more or less, or scientifically or scholarly, it is documented that the Armenian settlements in the Crimea, yeah, they were from Ani. And this Ani topos appears, I would say, as a lieu de mémoire, as a site of memory in the collective historic or the collective consciousness of the 19th century Armenians in Transylvania. This was a time when the immediate connection between the past and present was not anymore longer accessible. And this was the time when the Armenians in Transylvania were already integrated, and we can say almost fully assimilated into the Hungarian host society. And this was the time when probably the intellectuals of the Armenians of the Armenian community in Transylvania were already reading the travel account of Minas Bezseskeans. In this time, the Armenians in Transylvania also developed the identity construction. So I would say that this was the first step, and this was the central ideology for the Armenians in Transylvania. It was called Armenianism, in Hungarian Armenizmus. This ideology was a multi-layered struggle for the preservation of the Armenian identity. And the starting point, it was the loss of the Armenian language. Then, nevertheless, despite the Armenian descent, they tried to present themselves also in a friendly manner to the host society. This Armenianism was a historicizing ideology. If we would like, in a very short way to summarize it, it was the glorious history of the Armenians who were already not anymore speaking Armenian in the Hungarian host society. The Armenian cultural values were highlighted, and all of the values which made the Armenians very sympathetic to for the Hungarians. And this Ani, in this time, Ani appears in the sense of Pierre Nora's lieu de mémoire in the Transylvanian Armenian society. Firstly, it was connected with Gerla, with Szamosújvár, with Hayakarak. Because why? Because Ani was the universal capital of the Armenians, and which was very similar to the capital of the Armenians in Transylvania. And this argument we can see also, for example, from Yeria Hovhannisyan, although he was a lawyer in Budapest and he wrote in the 30s and 40s, 1930s and 40s, but here is a citation from him. As though Ani was flourishing at the foot of the Ararat, had continued at Gerla, at Szamosújvár, and at the other Armenian settlements, as though the incense-scented churches and chapels of Ani had moved to Transylvania, together with their faithful people. We can understand the profound religion of the Hungarian Armenians if we depart from Ani and go all the way to Transylvania. So we can see that Ani at the foot of Ararat, it was lived in Armenopolis, in Szamosújvár, in Gerla, and all the chapels and churches moved through the imagination to Transylvania, which means Gerla was kind of equivalent with Ani, and this was also the center, So Ani was, as we discussed, the center of the rich and aristocratic Armenians. This we can see also in Gerla, because Gerla was the richest Armenian city, and all of the inhabitants, the Armenian inhabitants in the majority, had aristocracy, nobility. It means that also other cities in the region had also similar positions. For example, Suceava, we find also comparisons in the case of Suceava, for example, by Suren Kolanchan. According to him, Suceava was also similar to Ani, but for the Armenians in Moldova and Bukovina, not for the Transylvanian Armenians. And Armenians liked to visit Suceava very often. They made a pilgrimage to Suceava based on Levon Babayan, who wrote a monograph on the Armenians in Moldova and Bukovina. He wrote that during the annual pilgrimage to Suceava, Suceava became like a piece of Armenia in the soul of Europe. And the other quotations here to the 1001 towered Ani, here the quasi-mythical depiction of a historical city is also existing in Transylvania. For example, Felix Avedik, a writer from Transylvania, tells or writes that legend has it that 1001 churches, 100,000 buildings collapsed, and 1 million souls chose to proclaim among Ani walls the prosperity and power of Armenia. Kristóf Szongot from Gerla, from Szamosújvár, a teacher, also emphasized two features of the Armenians in Transylvania, the wealth and the religiosity, that they were like very wealthy, rich, and they were religious persons, which means like they took gold in one of their bags and the Armenian sharakan, the hymnary, in their other bag, and they came on the way of the migration from Ani to Gerla, with this. And also he's formulating, I'm citing now Kristóf Szongot, the domestic Armenians took their origin from the most excellent families in the royal seat of Ani, capital of Armenia, which numbered 1 million inhabitants and 1,101 churches. They threw in luxury and pomp all around, but the enemies around them wanted to avenge them and headed towards the glorious Ani for the first and best of the nation what we had there. Many, however, still had some time to escape through the northern gate, so even Kristóf Szongot imagined the northern gate of the city. So every man, not women, but men, brought 2 bags and in one bag the prayer and church books, especially the beloved sharakans, so that they might praise the Lord in their native tongue, even in strange lands, and the other for all the gold, jewelry, and gemstones, and they took into their hands everything what they could bring, but these 2 were the important. And thus left all our ancestors their shining marble places, and after a final farewell to the ancient homeland, the Ararat and Paradise started to Transylvania. Gyula Merza, another writer, the co-editor of the Armenia periodical in Szamosújvár in Gerla at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, he kept also elements of this topos, but he laid particular stress on the Christian faith of the Armenians. He wrote the following, and I'm citing, "Still, it is a proven fact that the Armenians who fled to Transylvania were the offspring of the prominent and wealthy Armenian aristocracy that had supported the Crusades and thus incited the limitless void of the pagans. For after the Seljuk Turks and the Tatars had ravaged the capital of million people, 1001 toward Ani in the 13th century, and the independent national kingdom of Great Armenia was toppled. The very best of the Armenian families fled first from the terror and from the devastation and from the earthquakes. Thousands of those refugees of Christian faith wandered through the Caucasian rocks. The Armenian Museum in Samoshuivar in Armenopolis is a veritable treasury of those safeguarded codices and relics, which are the most telling documents of the ancient homeland on the one hand, and the various stations of wandering on the other. In the national memory of the Armenians in Transylvania, the consciousness of Armenian origins were all important at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. It was the primary link with the Armenians in a spiritual level, having already switched to the Catholicism, and the common language was the Hungarian. In my paper, The Memory of Ani developed from a real place of memory to an imagined place. Ani, as a lieu du mémoire, could serve as an interpretive model for understanding the process of identity construction for a special social group, especially for diasporic groups. The Ani-Armenians had only imaginations about their homeland, but this imagination was important for them because through this imagination, this imagination formulated them into a social diasporic group. And not only Bezseskáns didn't see Ani, but also the Armenians in East Central and East Europe also probably never saw the ruins of the old capital. The nostalgia for the lost times, for the golden age, was clearly a memory for the imagined, reconceived past. The golden age was in this case not only the richness, happiness, but the golden age was also probably much more the direct connection to the homeland. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Kovács Bálint, and I invite Karen Jalatian to give his lecture. Thank you. Under the title, The Photographic Afterlife of the Lost City of Ani.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I really need the microphone now, especially because my voice is a little bit lost, but it goes well with the theme of loss we're talking about. So it's my pleasure to be here with you to present before you. I should thank the organizers for this wonderful series of events, not just a symposium, for welcoming us, for hosting us, for showing great hospitality, and also for arranging all kinds of travels, etc. tomorrow as well. So just one word about myself. I'm a literary scholar, so I'm trained in comparative literature, but I also engage in visual studies and translation studies, and you'll see some of these visual studies elements that I will bring to you today in describing the photographic afterlives of Ani. So much has been said about Ani, so I will not provide any historical contextualization to you today. Instead, I will start by saying by describing a few kinds of photographs that, in a preliminary way, one could say exist about Ani or for Ani or with Ani. So first we have early photographs of Ani, and you will see, I will mention one of the main figures now. Oh, perfect. So we have two groups of early photographs of Ani, one by Johannes Kürkjan. You will see a little bit of information about him here. We have another set of photographs by actually a family of photographers, and they were assistants to Nikolai Mar, who was mentioned a few times already, Aram and Ardashes Verurs. I will show you photographs and information about them. So these are early photographs of Ani, and I will argue today that, especially with Kürkjan, these photographs are basically romantic nationalist representations of Ani. Very similar to what Dr. Kovács just described, what also was described earlier with Professor Kawi and other presenters today. As for Nicolas Mar's photographs, I describe them as sort of like both nationalistic but also imperialistic representations of Ani. So I will try to explain what that means. So in addition to these two kinds of photographs of Ani, there are also those taken by scholars and travelers from Europe, broadly speaking, right? One name that should be mentioned is Jean-Michel and Nicole Thierry, who were physicians and archaeologists of the second half of the 20th century. And these photographs are important from the perspective of the Armenian diaspora or in the Armenian world in general, because as you know, in most of the 20th century, Ani was part of the, like now today, part of the Turkey, and there was not much access from the Armenian side to Ani. Right, so these photographs, they show us and tell us about specific kinds of gazes that make them possible, that create these photographs. Additionally, we also have photographs from different, but also somewhat similar Turkish and Kurdish perspectives or gazes. I will not delve into them today, but one should also consider them as possible kind of photographic production. Two more categories. We have photographs from Armenian pilgrims. This topic of conducting pilgrimages to Ani was touched upon by Dr. Sekersky's presentation. And of course, the last, sort of like, or at least the penultimate kind of photographs that we have from Ani are the conservationist photographs. This is a very interesting development. I don't mean to be too optimistic about this, but this conservationist attitude towards the ruins, which is a latest, let's say, I would say, the latest development in the way of relating to Ani. Perhaps there's some hope that this kind of gaze is avoiding some of the ideological trappings of the previous kinds of ways of looking at Ani. So we'll talk about that a bit later. And of course, there is a post-Soviet reality where the border is relatively open compared to the Soviet times. Armenians can actually nowadays visit Ani through Georgia, of course. And so there are all kinds of new photographic productions that are generated around Ani. Now, my argument is that in separating these different kinds of photographs that are made from Ani, there is a lot of repetition or reproduction of this gaze, but there's also a lot of overlap and development. So a photograph can be both imperialistic and nationalistic. This I will argue soon for you. Now, let me say a few words about this, about Kürkçan and then the other group. Just 1 second. Yes, so as far as we know, the first person who has photographed Ani is Johannes Kürkçan, born in Gurin, Vilayet of Sebast, Ottoman Empire. Kürkçan settled in Tbilisi and Yerevan. In the late 1870s, when Ani, along with Kars, was incorporated into the Russian Empire, Kürkçan visited and photographed Ani. Around 1880, he published an album of photographs in French and in Armenian, and not in Russian, titled Ruines d'Arménie, in Amsterdam, as you can see. This album contains some 40 stereoscopic pairs of photographs accompanied by text. It is said that the Russian authorities banned the circulation of this book, suspecting that it fanned nationalist hopes among Armenians, counter to the Russian imperial project. Parts of these photos were reprinted in London's The Graphic on September 26, 1885. They were also published in Vue de Caucase series shortly after, apparently sold for a more touristic use. So as you can see, these photographs were, at least by the person who made them, our nationalistic way of reviving our last Armenian homeland, etc. But they also find circulation and other ways of being watched by tourists, Westerners, etc. Kürkçan's photos of Ani fall within a modern, national, melancholic, revivalist fascination with ruins. It has been noted that some of the reclining figures in his photographs. So let's look actually at some of Kürkçan's photographs. And just a quick note, this person who is standing at the rampart is Kürkçan himself. So there's almost a selfie element or auto-photographing element to this work. So he's standing on the walls. This is the cathedral. If you look closely, you will notice there are usually people posing. You will see right now inside. Well, this is not exactly a cathedral. This is the mosque that we saw, the Manuchir Mosque, which was made into a museum later with Nikolai Mar. Yeah, so, all right, let's stop here. So, It has been noted that some of the reclining figures in these photographs evoke the motif of Mother Armenia, which was presented just recently, just before me, which was popularized as representing Armenia by the publisher Ani-Armenians. Kürkçan's photographs echoing and inserting themselves into the modern nationalizing drives is an instance of self-discovery already exemplified by auto-ethnographers such as Garegin Cervantians. These are mid-19th century Armenian ethnographers who go to the Armenian natives and generate ethnography in an attempt to revive or create or construct Armenian nationhood in Armenia, who, for example, in 1878-74 published the Daredevils of Sassoon, which is a major Armenian epic, not to mention Mkhitari's father, Revand Alishan, whom Dr. Kovac just mentioned, as well as his predecessors, also Mkhitari's fathers, Lukas Injidjan and Minas Bzhishkian, which was also just mentioned. In this manner, newly emerging photography inserts itself into modern national visual and iconographic currents that have already formed among Armenians. Yes. The second group of Ani photographs are the ones taken by the Russian imperial archaeologist Nikolai Mar. Well, exactly not by Mar, but by his assistants. Mar was a second generation Russian Orientalist scholars, born in Kutaisi, Georgia. His mother was Georgian, his father Scottish, who died early on. Mar grew up in poverty. He developed interest in philology, studied Georgian and Armenian in 1891, became a privat docent in the St. Petersburg University. Inspired by French and English archaeological works, the Imperial Academy of Science in St. Petersburg initiated excavations in Ani, led by Mar first, in 1892 and 1893. Mar led numerous excavations of Ani well into the second decade of the 20th century. This was the period that was referred by Professor Hartmann as the more stable period when the Russian Empire actually was administrating and possessing, in a sense, these areas up to Kars and I think a bit more. Yes. He was assisted by, among others, by Aram Veruish, an Armenian man of theater and photographer, and Toros Toramanyan, the architect and architectural historian, who is known for having worked with the Polish-Austrian art historian of Joseph Strygotsky to formulate the well-known but outdated thesis that medieval Armenian architecture exerted an originary force on European architecture. They joined Mar's team along with ethnographer, historian Ashkarabet Kalandar and Hoseb Orbeli, the painter Arshak Fetfatjan, the historian Nicolas Adons, and Aram Veruish's son Ardashes Veruish, who became Mar's photographer. The second group of photographs of Ani has an interesting connection with the first. We are told that Aram Veruish was already helping Kürkçan to photograph Ani. So there is a hidden continuity or perhaps an ambivalence in the attitude of Aram and Ardashes Veruish, who must have understood the differences between Kürkçan's nationalistic romantic way of photographing Ani and Mar's more imperialistic scientific way of approaching the ruins of Ani. The numerous excavations that Mar's team conducted around Ani led to a great number of publications. Most significant among these is the Ani series, Anitskaya Syria in Russian, in Imperial Russian, Anio Shark. It seems that Mar was one of the main, if not the main individual, beyond the creation of this series. Its first number appeared in 1906. To my knowledge, over only 6 publications were printed. The second one in 1908, the third one, fourth one in 1910, and fifth and sixth in 1911. It is noteworthy that they not explicitly in the title whenever the booklet contains pictures or stills. So I will try to show you some of these publications, but a little bit more of Mar and Veruish. Yeah, so this is the Ani series. The first 2 volumes are authored by Mar. Only the first number is bilingual in Russian and Armenian. The rest are only in Russian, even though all of the publications have partially bilingual cover page, the general title of the series. From the forward and the afterward, the first 2 publications, we learned that one of the significant issues was the financing of the publication of this series. The Imperial Academy of Sciences allocated relatively meager funds for it. It was the Armenians, the Armenian Church Council in St. Petersburg, and most likely other well-to-do benefactors who supported it with much more funds. This detail is important to note as it shows the balancing act that Mar must have carried out on the one hand, representing the Imperial Academy of Sciences, that is the Russian Imperial Knowledge Production Project, and on the other hand, receiving support from Armenian benefactors who naturally want to see a more Armenian national way of treating Ani. As Vera Tolce has argued, Mar was part of the liberal current of imperial academics. This is understood from the Enlightenment-inspired universalist cosmopolitan attitudes manifested by them. Broadly speaking, the liberal imperial scholars believed in an integrationist ideology with regard to the non-Russian communities that are now part of the empire. They defended their scholarly projects and collaborations with native informants by arguing that the knowledge that is produced will help to better integrate those populations into the Russian Empire. This attitude and the balancing act that Mar carries out with it can be gleaned from the Ani series publications itself. For instance, in the afterword to the second Ani series, Mar defends the excavations in Ani on the grounds that it advances knowledge. Moreover, while the publication begins by emphasizing the Armenian aspect of Ani, its fifth and sixth numbers emphasize the city's non-Armenian elements. Scholars have noted that Mar used Ani to develop a non-homogeneous interactive model of cultural life in relation particularly to the linguistic theories that Mar were to propose. In addition to this Ani series, Mar lectured and published on the excavations in Ani. This work is in a sense culminated in the 1934 book Ani, The Textual History of the City and the Excavations of the Site of its Fortification, published by the National Academy of History of Material Culture in Leningrad and Moscow in 1934, the year when Mar died. At this point, Ani is well known within the borders of the newly established Republic of Turkey. With this book, we are dealing with a major moment of the afterlife of Mar's work in Soviet times. This book comes with a much numerous list of photographs and visuals. So, a few more photographs. This is from the Ani series. This is the mosque, which was turned into a museum. As Dr. Sikersky noted, there is perhaps the first Armenian museum established on site. These are some visuals. This is the first map of Ani. I want to skip, perhaps I can find, yes. So this is the book that I was mentioning, this 1934 book. And what's fascinating, if you look closely at this book on the corner, you can see that Mar's book is using Johannes Cruikshank's photo of Ani, but there is no captions, there is no references, nothing. So you can gain a sense of how these photographs were traveling in very specialized ways within the Russian Empire in the early days of the Soviet Union. Yes? Mar's contribution to linguistics has received quite a lot of attention from early on, attracting both followers and detractors. It seems to have two phases. In one phase, or I guess I can summarize this much more quickly, Mar rejected this kind of, let's say, linguistic family model in the European languages, Uralic languages, etc. For him, eventually language was developed through different phases, and these phases obeyed social rules, social class logic. And this is where you can see how he took his ideology towards Marxism and towards communism. Yes. Later on, of course, Mar's ideas are debunked, so nobody seriously considers them anymore. But we can see how this kind of imperial, socialist, communist ideological lenses were forming the representations of Ani in the Soviet Empire, within the Soviet Union. So I'm skipping a little bit here. Yes. So one of the arguments that I want to make with you today is that we, at least with the early photographs of Ani that we have, which I characterize as one nationalistic in a romantic 19th century sense, and the other one imperialistic, we have to sort of like have a concept, a certain concept of, which I call fascination, that these photographs that are behind, let's say, these photographs. Now, one of the main scholars who has thought about photographs and also history is Walter Benjamin, and he suggests that photographs have a sense of aura, or works of art have a kind of aura. And the aura is something for Benjamin which cannot be reproduced through mechanical means of reproduction. Right? In modern times, in modernity, we can have mass reproduction of things. For Benjamin, art is the exact opposite of that. A work of art, or the essence of the work of art, cannot be reproduced. Therefore, there's something singular and present in that moment, in that place and time for a work of art to be a work of art. So Benjamin called this aura. Yes. Another concept that I want to use for the interpretation of these photographs is the notion of fascination. In other words, yes, in the modern times, when Armenians, like other groups like Albanians, Greeks, when they were developing their romantic nationalist projects, there was a sense of loss. Yes, the natives, the Revond Alishans and the Buzhishkans wanted to tell these Armenians that now you are part of the Armenian nature. This was the modernizing construction of national identity. But because this was done through ideological lenses, let's say nationalization or imperialism later, there's a certain desire, a certain thing that is missing that is driving these ideologies forward. The desire to build a nation, to construct a modern nation, or to construct a cosmopolitan integrationist empire, which is the Russian Empire. So I would say that behind this construction of loss, Ani as a lost city, there's a sense of lack that is showcased by ideology. Beyond ideology, there is a sense of lack, and this lack fascinates. So people, when they go to Ani, when they try to create scholarship or national narratives, or we can say similar thing from the Turkish side, when they want to downplay or erase the Armenian presence and they want to emphasize the Seljuk part of the history, etc., they're also constructing national narratives with a certain idea of a certain lack behind it. That is the desire to construct a certain kind of Turkishness, a certain kind of past. So this is the sense that I want to emphasize in looking at these photographs, but also the idea that these photographs come from a very specific context and they were meant to do specific things. So in the Soviet Union, for example, again, Armenians, after the establishment of the Soviet Union from Soviet Armenia, they could not go to Ani and carry out excavations and visits, etc. So these photographs, in a way, they were the only things that they had from Ani. Of course, they also had some archaeological findings and artifacts, etc., etc. So these photographs had a very specific kind of afterlife in the Soviet Union. They were very heavily ideological, I would say. The goal for us, I think, as we think about these photographs now, is first of all, is to try to understand the history of these photographs. This is very important, but also try to not necessarily reproduce the way they have been looked at before. Yes, so we don't have to renationalize or re-imperialize once again when we look at these photographs, but to try to take certain critical distances and see maybe there's other things that are going on with these photographs that can give new kinds of afterlives to these photographs. So these are like the final point that I would like to make with you. This whole project with the attempt to read photographs in a new way is very important, because at stake is, as was mentioned already many times today during the presentations, is the understanding and the future of collective memory. This is what is at stake. Collective memory can be dealt with or related with in a very passive way, simply by reproducing what was inherited, let's say, 10 years ago, 40 years ago, 70 years ago, or 100 and 200 years ago. Or it can be thought through and related in a very active way, actively shaping the way we understand the past, the way we interpret the past. And so with this, I want to connect a little bit with Transylvania and the collective memory of Transylvanians, which is also very important. It is up to us, I think, and up to many of you actually in this room, I'm guessing, to both respect and unearth the traces, these photographs, the objects that constituted the social and the artistic life of a community, be that of Hungarians in Transylvania, Hungarian Armenians in Transylvania, but also to think new ways of interpreting them, to give them new afterlives, new exciting ways of interpreting, so that this past can take new meanings for us, as opposed to simply become something that is only in the past that needs to be sort of like passively related to. So this is how I would like to end, and also thank you.
Thank you very much, Karan. And now I invite, last but not least, Dr. Vahe Tashian to keep his lecture.
Thank you. So my talk today is about architecture, or how Armenians, mostly early 20th century, adopted the concepts of purity in architecture and how this idea or concepts were developed later. One of the protagonists that I will mention here, Father Papken Güleserian, who later became Catholicos of Cilicia, he has many articles on this topic, architecture, but he has also many articles on the purity in language, Armenian language. And I'm using this opportunity to say that in several of his articles on purity of language, Armenian language, he's making parallels with other situations of Armenians living in other environment. And there you can find very interesting passages with Transylvania, Armenians in Transylvania. For example, in his articles, and these articles are focused on the situation of the Armenian language in the Ottoman Empire, and he's explaining why in some places, some geographical areas of the Ottoman Empire, Armenians became Turkish speakers, and he came from a Turkish speaker family, from Aintab, and he's making parallels with other situations like the Armenians in the United States. These articles were written in the 1920s, or the Armenians in the Russian Empire and the Armenians in Transylvania. And these passages are very interesting, just to mention this. And another note, my presentation today was going to be a joint presentation with my friend and colleague Joseph Restom, and he was going to join us via Zoom from Lebanon, from Beirut. And so all the parts concerning, he's the architect, I'm the historian, so all the parts concerning technical issues with architecture, but also many parts of the history of architecture are his sections. And I will read these sections. Unfortunately, he will not join us because of the situation in Lebanon, because of the war in Lebanon. Otherwise, you will hear the drones, Israeli drones flying over his head. So this is the situation, and I will present it alone. I would like to begin my presentation with a quote from article written by Yervant Odian, published in 1926. Yervant Odian, he was a very famous Armenian writer, a satirist. He was working at that time as a columnist in 1926 for a newspaper, Armenian newspaper in Cairo, Arev, the Sun in Armenian. He survived the genocide, and in early 1920s, having definitively left his hometown of Istanbul, he lived in exile in Cairo. So at that time, the church of Saint Gregory the Illuminator, Sub Kriko Lusavoric of Cairo, was in its final phase of construction. So in July 1926, accompanied by a few friends, Odian visited the site of the construction. And the visitors were amazed by the beauty of the building, but what was fascinated them most was the church architecture, the Armenian architecture, as Odian wrote in this article. It was at this point that one of the visitors uttered the following phrase, I quote, "It looks as it was moved from Ani 1,000 years ago to here," end quote. So the Cairo church was inaugurated on February 11 and 12, 1928, during the prelator of Archbishop Torkom Kushakian. He was the prelate of Armenians in Egypt. Archbishop Torkom's role was crucial in the construction of this church, of this project, as well as in the choice of its architectural style. In a book that he wrote just after the inauguration of Sud Kriko Lusavoric, so this church, he tries to present the construction of the church in Cairo as an architectural achievement, or more precisely, as the triumph of an architectural model. As he writes in his book, Armenians, and here he's speaking more about the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, were generally unaware of the architectural splendor and richness of Armenian churches of the medieval period, some of whose remains were still to be found in historically Armenian regions of the Ottoman Empire, like in Mush, in Erzinga, in Van, while others were located on the borders of Tsarist Russia, in the Ararat Plain, or on the site of the ancient city of Ani. This is why, continues Archbishop Torkom, Ottoman Armenians cut off from this rich and beautiful heritage had long tended, and here I quote again Torkom, Archbishop Torkom, to build churches with simple architecture, or in the best of cases, their churches were basilica-shaped, erected with columns and featuring spacious interiors in order to accommodate the greatest number of believers, end quote. So this, my presentation today, is about the triumph of an architectural model of churches. The Church of Cairo, with its centrally planned structure and its similarity to the churches of Ani and the plain of Ararat, was the first built on this model in post-genocide period by an Armenian architect. As well as we're going to see there were already Armenian churches in Europe built on the same model. However, in the pre-genocide period, the Armenian churches built in the Ottoman Empire in particular did not follow this model, which remained relatively marginal. So, interest in Armenian medieval churches or church architecture appears with the 19th century with European voyagers like Frédéric Dubois de Montperneux or Henry Lynch, who were the first to refer to an architecture as being Armenian. And with the late of 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, the historiography of Armenian architecture will be marked by a major figure, Polish-Austrian art historian Józef Strigowski, and his comrade in research, Armenian architect Toros Toramanyan. In the midst of the dark years of the genocide, Strigowski will write the first comprehensive study of Armenian religious architecture, Die Baukunst der Armenier und Europa, and illustrate it with Toramanyan's surveys and photographs. Strigowski's theory on Armenian architecture was largely shaped by the political, ideological, and cultural context of the début du siècle in Vienna. He argues that the distinctive features of what he considers to be the typical Armenian church, that means a central plan, a dome supported by a half conical squinches, and a conical roof that shields the dome, originated in Iranian domestic architecture and served first as an urform for all Armenian churches and later spread out to inspire medieval religious architecture in Europe. And the work of Strigowski was not exceptional among historians of his time. During the early 20th century, the origins of medieval religious architecture were topics of heated nationalist debates. And after the genocide, Armenian genocide, Strigowski considered that the centrally planned churches were tools of survival for a race and a nation that was driven by the will to preserve national identity through stylistic purity. So the ideas of Strigowski progressively made their way in Armenian circles. There is no doubt that the Armenian genocide played an important role in concentrating interest in what was now considered as an endangered heritage. Churches like the Cathedral of Ani will serve to crystallize the vision of a purely Armenian architecture for communities scattered in the diaspora. Indeed, in the tangible space of the cities in which they were building their new quarters, what could have better embodied the identity of the Armenian newcomers and made it visible and understandable to other communities than building of a church. So in these conditions, Strigovsky's ideas will meet two other factors that will allow the development of a triumphant model for Armenian churches in the diaspora. A way of teaching architecture based on copying existing architectural models, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and a construction material that will make these copies easy to make, the concrete. Characterized at the time by a classical education that emphasized the importance of academic composition to the detriment of the changes brought to architectural design by the Industrial Revolution, the Beaux-Arts provided the ideal context for the development of an architecture based on the reproduction of historical forms. The Beaux-Arts epitomized an approach to architectural education that is consistent with the revivalist trend of the time, a trend that used architecture to confer legitimacy and historical depth to existing or newly formed nations from China to the USA. Indeed, most of the architects who will build the first Armenian churches that are based on the medieval model were students of the Beaux-Arts, the first ones not even being Armenians, as in the case of the Saint John the Baptist Church in Paris, built by Albert Désiré Gilbert, graduate of the Beaux-Arts in 1892, or the Saint Archangel Church in Bucharest, built by Dimitri Maimarolu, graduate again of the Beaux-Arts of 1885, and the St. Sarkis Church in London, built by Arthur Joseph Davis, graduate of 1898. Now let's see how the Armenian context, how this Armenian concept, these architectural concepts were developed in the Armenian context. And here I will present very briefly some texts and activities of Archbishop Papken Güleserian. Here's the one. Like Archbishop Torkom, the prelate of Cairo, I think that he played a key role in making this architectural style official in Armenian world. Like Torkom, he was a graduate of the Armash religious seminary. Armash was a seminary located in Bursa in the Ottoman Empire. And in Armash and later after Armash, the paths of Papken and Torkom will cross several times. And that's why I think that it is necessary to take a quick role at the Armash Seminary, which was the starting point of their meeting, the place where they received their spiritual but also ideological formation. So the Armash Seminary was founded by Archbishop Marakia Ormanian. He became later the Patriarch of Armenians in Constantinople. Teaching in this religious and educational establishment was based on the ideas and concepts of the Armenian cultural renaissance, the Armenian Zartong in Armenian, that had marked Armenian intellectual life in the Ottoman Empire from the mid-19th century onwards. If I were to describe Armash in a single word, I would say that this establishment was the equivalent of the propaganda fide of the Catholic Church in Rome. Armash had trained numerous clergymen, many of whom, like Torkom or Papken, would go on to play leading roles in religious, cultural, and community affairs. Papken became the chief editor of the Louis in Armenian Light Weekly from 1905 to 1906. And during these 2 years, Louis, this journal, became an ecclesiastical periodical, somehow the unofficial organ of the Armash Seminary, or more precisely, a space where all the reformist ideas of Armashagan from Armash clergymen, among them was also Archbishop Torkom, were published as articles. So it was in this context that we find in 1905, in the pages of Louis, two articles of Popken on the issue of church architecture. In the first one, Popken expresses his dissatisfaction with the Armenian architects, their indifference to Strigovsky's ideas, particularly regarding the uniqueness and historical value of centrally planned Armenian churches. Of course, it was bold of Popken to express, although it was done in a very cautious way, such ideas in his periodical, especially in 1905 in Istanbul, where Sultan Abdulhamid's regime enforced strict censorship. And during this period, the use, for example, words like nation, national, Armenia in the Armenian press could lead to imprisonment for authors. He was about to express this, these are photos from Armash. He was about to express, Popken, his dissatisfaction with the Armenian architects once again during the same year, and this time it was in an article related to the construction of the Paris church, the Saint John Baptist Church of Paris, which was built in 1902. Here produces, in the pages of Louis, a letter signed by Albert Gilbert, so the architect of the Paris church, where he, the architect, writes that before preparing the plan of the church, he looked at numerous Armenian church photos. However, as Gilbert puts it, they lacked character. They don't remind us of Armenian art. Popken's comment on this is very poignant. I quote, "The observation of our instructed architect is very right. The new constructed Armenian churches remind us very little of Armenian art," end quote. So what we can see in this example is the fact that the same architectural concepts were already adopted early 20th century by Armenian intellectuals, mainly those who represented the Armenian Renaissance generation. Popken survived the Armenian genocide. He was at that time in the US at the start of the World War I. And after the armistice, he came to Jerusalem, where he became the chief editor of Sion, which was the periodical of the Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem. And in 1928, he was elected coadjutor Catholicos of the Armenian Church of Cilicia. So he moved to Antelias, Lebanon, the new seat of the Catholicosat. And this was a new time in Armenian history. It was the post-genocide years. The watchword of the day was national reconstruction. It was imperative to regroup the survivors of the genocide and start a new life, a new community life, mainly in the new states of the Middle East like Syria and Lebanon. And the Armenian communal elites' expectations were to transform the mass of Armenian refugees into a trans-nation, a homogeneous society committed to its national characteristics. Catholicos Popken was also part of this elite. His dream was to recreate the Armenian Armash on this eastern Mediterranean coast in Antelias, with its seminary, its library, its printing house. And he has largely succeeded in achieving this dream during his lifetime. There were also all the possibilities to build new churches at that time on the model of Ani and the plain Ararat's cathedrals. This will be realized in 1939 in Antelias, 3 years after his death, by the construction of the Cathedral of the Saint Gregory the Illuminator in Antelias. The Cathedral of Antelias was conceived by Mardiros Altunian, who also studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. The Ani model in Beirut will be applied 1 year earlier in 1938 by architect Dikran Khoubeserian, graduated again from a university in France, who will build in a highly symbolic place, the center of the city of Beirut, opposite to the headquarters of the French governor. Lebanon at that time was under French mandate, a replica of the Ani Cathedral, the Armenian Orthodox Saint Neshan Cathedral. Moreover, the building was constructed after the demolition of an older Armenian church that was built according to local traditional models. The absolute model for the construction of this cathedral was the Cathedral of Ani, a choice that was dictated at that time by the Catholicos Papken himself. Interestingly, the church was further Armenianized after the end of the Lebanon War in 2003. The barrel vaults, and this is Joseph's part, so it's very technical words that I will use here. The barrel walls were topped with gable roofs to accentuate the resemblance with the original Ani model, and a stone cladding was also added. This comes in the wake of a civil war in a highly symbolic space, the city center, in which all religious communities in Lebanon sought representation through religious architecture. In conclusion, the Surp-Neshan Cathedral is an interesting example of the multiple uses of the Ani model because it was Armenianized in 1938, if one considers the pre-existing church, and re-Armenianized in 2003. The elements of the past were resuscitated twice and given each time a different meaning. During the French Mandate, the Ani model served for the reconstruction of a community in exile and its integration in its host country, in Lebanon. The model here was largely inspired by the internalization of a Western Orientalist gaze on the community that inspired, if not dictated, the model. And the second time, the re-Armenization was part of a post-war discourse on national reconciliation and of a neoliberal pastiche perception of cultural heritage that placed the Ani model among the many other models of Beirut city center, as you can see here on the map, next to the Santa Maria Maggiore of Rome, model for the St. George Maronite Church, or the Suleymaniya Mosque of Istanbul, which was served as model for the Al-Amin Sunni Mosque. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all the three presenters. And now I give the floor to architect Dr. Virgil Pop to address some thoughts about Armenian architecture and especially Transylvanian Armenian architecture. If he wishes, of course, please at the podium. And then I ask the public to prepare their questions. Thank you.
I think it's better if I stay here. I'm not the main speaker. I have some thoughts related to the speeches that we have before. I think the last one related to the architecture of Armenian churches reflect in a way the evolution of the European mentality about the architecture. And when the Armenians from Lebanon, they westernized themselves as a culture, they take the roots of the, let's say, national movement of architecture of Europe. There is something like that in Germany or France. It was in 19th century and second half of 19th century. And later it was something like that at the beginning of 20th century in Romania. For instance, it's very similar, the church of Armenians from Bucharest with other churches from Europe. The difference is 20 or 30 years, that's all. The phenomenon is the same. And also I have some thoughts related to, I think, two of the speeches that we listened before about the work of Sturzygovsky. The work of Sturzygovsky, it's very, very important for Transylvania. Why? Because it was that huge debate at the beginning of 20th century in Vienna, and they have there 2 chairs for history of art because of the argue between Sturzygovsky and I think it was Dvorak, who has the other chair in Vienna. No, it was something unique in the history of art to have 2 chairs in the same university for history of art. And one pupil of Sturzygovsky was a very important historian, Vătășanu, from Cluj, and he came in Cluj, and in the 50s and in the 60s, he made a school of history of art. And almost all the art historians are pupils of Vătășanu. And for that reason, the influence of Sturzygovsky is very important in Cluj. And he was probably, this is out of date, the theory that the Armenian, this Ani architecture, let's say, has a huge influence on the Gothic architecture. Probably, I don't know, nobody's talking about that in these days after more than 100 years later. It will be interesting to see what you think about this influence of architecture, of Armenian architecture about the Gothic architecture. And probably it's out of date. And another thought related to the pictures of Ani. It was the pictures taken at the beginning of the century or at the end of 19th century are an inventory of heritage. And during that time, they became heritage. Absolutely, the pictures are more interesting than the heritage that is in the pictures, because today we have a different way of seeing the architecture of Ani. And those pictures are heritage by themselves. No.
Thank you very much. If anyone of the lecturers would like to address an answer, or I open the floor for the public.
Questions between us?
Yes, of course. In the meantime, may I ask Professor Kovács if there will be a follow-up of this conference. I would suggest something about this phenomenon of acculturation, about Transylvanian Armenian or Romanian Armenian, Hungarian Armenian relationship through every corner of history of art, or something like that.
So you mean follow up in a sense at the MCC? Yeah, we can even suggest the Armenian department for the MCC. So if you are open for it, we can bring a lot of topics here to discuss, and we will be very happy if you can host also in the future such a conferences, definitely. Yeah.
If I may just add very quickly, I would say that. Can I have one?
Yes, please.
So I would say that, I mean, a lot of people know about this but I would emphasize the fact that there are lots of photographs of Transylvanian Armenians from the late 19th century to the early decades of the 20th century. And to distinguished professors' comments at the end, I think one could also study these photographs as repositories of heritage and understand the Transylvanian Armenian experience through these photographs as well. So this might be one topic to present on in the long term.
Can we know anything very shortly about the actual state of the churches, for instance, in Elizabethopolis or Armenopolis? But I give the microphone to Bálint Julia. Okay. Julia Bálint.
Csak akkor, ha fordítja.
Szívesen.
Én mondom magyarul. Nem tudom, hogy a mi őseink nemesek voltak-e,
I don't know if our ancestors were noblemen or noble gen coming from Ani, but I know that 58 families received Hungarian nobility, coat of arms, and after 3 days from now, we will keep a Remembrance Day of October. Yes. In 3 days, so on October the 6th, there will be a national commemorative day of the martyrs of the 89 revolution and war of independence. And Lázár Vilmos and Kis Ernő were hanged, respectively, executed, but they were of Armenian origin. So Armenian Hungarians or Hungarian Armenians, which is correct. Magyar örmények vagy örmény magyarok?
Örmény magyarok. Mit állítok?
Armenian Hungarians.
Milyen magyar? Örmény. Díszítőjel.
So Armenian is an adjective. What am I? I am a Hungarian. What kind of Hungarian? Armenian Hungarian.
Van-e ilyen a magyar nyelvben, hogy díszítőjelző?
And there is an adjective, an epitheton ordinance. Thank you, Attila. Professor Kawi, can I provoke you to reflect on?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Hungarian, Armenian, or Armenian?
Yes. So I think that you could argue that there is a development here. And we can see this, of course, in many places. I find it on a regular basis in Los Angeles, where I am. I was asked earlier today, this is a very strange place to be. So it's very far from here, from Armenia, and so on. But in fact, of course, the very opposite is true. That in fact, this is the third largest grouping of Armenians worldwide. The largest, of course, is in the Armenian capital, in Yerevan. The second is in Moscow. And the third, and the most complex and diverse, is in Los Angeles. And obviously, Armenians have been in Los Angeles for quite a long time, several decades. They began to settle there after the Armenian genocide in the 1920s. And the process of continuing to settle in Los Angeles continues until today. As we speak, new Armenians are settling in Los Angeles day by day. At the same time, of course, which I think is also enormously important, because it is a diasporic center, is that every day Armenians are leaving Los Angeles and spreading out now into other parts of California, other parts of the United States, which is very normal. So what I want very quickly of us to consider is this process of development. So imagine that we have then that first generation that came and settled in the 1920s. Obviously, if we were to have the opportunity to ask them, who are you, exactly as we did just a moment ago, they would say, we are Armenians. And so obviously this is a noun, not an adjective. So I think that it's possible to argue, there are of course many variations to this, but I do think that this is one trajectory that is worthwhile contemplating in a number of different places. And this, of course, has been discussed in sociological discourse in different settings, different parts of Europe, for example. So you start out with one ethnic identity, and then it becomes more complicated, it becomes more diverse, and so you may say that, well, I am an Armenian, I am an American Armenian. So I am definitely Armenian, this is the core of my identity, but I acknowledge that, of course, a great deal of the factor entering into that is from my new environment, my new home. This process continues. So if we think of something like, to make it simple, let's just say 4 generations. So the first generation settles and they say, we are Armenian. The second will say, we are American Armenian. The third may say, you can see the whole point I'm arguing for, that I am Armenian American. And then obviously the possibility exists of a 4th generation to say, I am American. And of Armenian extraction, but the Armenian element is so slight that it doesn't even merit the use of the epithet. So I think that this is one possibility. At the same time, one of the things, so I'm using Los Angeles as a basis. And so here you see I'm establishing this theory. And we might argue that overall it looks quite plausible. It's very systematic, and we have these 4 elements. But very often, of course, and this is one of the points I think is very important for us to bear in mind, this is not enough in and of itself. We're doing this purely mentally. It's a mental exercise we're doing in this room. But we are not in Los Angeles. We are not following the actual situation which is happening, as I say, on a daily basis in that major center. And one of the points that I just made undermines the structure that I just created. And what is that? The whole point is that this is a fluid situation. We cannot isolate these groups independently and separate them from their everyday developing environment. So one of the key issues that we see on a regular basis in Los Angeles is that this community is always evolving. So one of the things which I think is very significant here is that we have whole waves of settlement in Los Angeles. And therefore, to some degree, this of course impacts the perfection of the theory that we have just outlined. Which I think is extremely important from an Armenian perspective. That so with these continual waves of settlement, as we're moving towards the 3rd, so I am Armenian American, or we're moving to the 4th, I am American, this is undermined, this is subverted by the fact that we continually have new waves of Armenians coming from different parts of Europe, from the Middle East, from the Armenian Republic, and continually what we see is that the pool of Armenians who identify directly with this core, I am Armenian, they are continually entering into the local community, with the result that we have I am American, I am Armenian, they are juxtaposed in the same city, and therefore, of course, this complicates enormously this sort of very elegant structure that I outlined at the beginning. Obviously, life is very messy. It's not ordered, structured, as I just suggested. So obviously we can imagine that there are those 4 categories. We can define them, but to apply them on a regular basis in any given living environment is going to be very difficult. So I think that this can be a model that can be used to a greater or lesser degree, but we have to be very, very open to all the various factors that impact identity on the real life basis of living communities. So that's very important for us to bear in mind too.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Hartmann.
If I may, I just wanted to add a few more comments on that topic of identity, because it's not only that the generations could give different answers, but within the same society or even within the same family, different members of that family may give different answers to the same question. And this can be due to a biographical coincidence, or, for instance, due to gender. Imagine a family with a brother and a sister. Usually, since we are still living in quite patriarchal structures, the female part of the family stays more at home and is more exposed to the mothers. So usually, when the language is gradually lost, it is very often that the female parts of the society still know better the traditional language and other parts, other segment of traditional heritage, let alone food. We speak so much about architecture, about language, about religion, but what about food? When everything else is lost, the food is still there. So, and who's usually preparing the food? So, now I give you an example of an Armenian, and especially in situations of pressure. In the United States, that pressure may be assimilation pressure, a social pressure. There is no political pressure, but clearly a social pressure to assimilate, such as a colleague of mine called the United States Society a carnivore society for all immigrants, to lose their original culture very quickly. In a country like Turkey, where, of course, at least in Istanbul, there is still an Armenian community. And, of course, throughout Turkey, we have a certain segment of the population that traces its ancestry back to Armenian roots. But these Armenian roots were the famous Armenian grandmothers or the hidden Armenians. These were Armenian genocide survivors who survived as small children or young women during the genocide years, because they were taken out of the marches of deportation and saved physically, but to the price that they had to convert. And they live with Muslims, Muslim, Turkish, or Kurdish identity, and they used to hide their Armenian identity. So their children, and in these families, identity becomes a really complicated issue, because usually the Armenian grandmother was an abducted and raped Armenian young girl or woman. And her husband used to be the abductor. So we have a victim and the perpetrator in the same family, and what happens to the children of that family? And again, gender is crucial, because we are living in, now I'm talking about the Turkey early Republican period of Turkey, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, very patriarchal society, and a society where Armenians were forced to live under the condition of rejecting their own identity because of fear. Again, the female part, the daughters of these families, they would learn a little bit of Armenian dialect, if at all. They were staying in the kitchen. The men, they had to go out. They had to go to military service, to the Turkish army, where they were either beaten up or they had to hide their identity. But because the identity, Christian or the village, the other villagers would know, so they had a hard life, hiding their identity or becoming super religious, super nationalist, right the contrary, where the female members of the family would still cling. So if you ask the members of that family, and then if you ask the next generation, the grandchildren, who are you or what's your identity? Some members of the same family would deny and say, we have nothing to do with Armenians. And the sister of that very family would say, we are Armenians. Or one part of the family emigrates, and then once they emigrated out of Turkey, they try to live their Armenian identity. I have given Armenian language classes to this kind of people in Berlin, in Germany. They would come as guest workers, and then part of the family would continue to live, let's say, as Sunni Muslims or Alevi, which is a religious minority in Turkey. But other parts of the family, they were Turkish-speaking, coming from the provinces, not from Istanbul. But then once they started living in Berlin, they had organized an Armenian community, a little bit of Armenian church life, because they identified via their Christianity. So they would go to church, and they wanted their children to learn Armenian. And now, a couple of them, some families, their daughters were all married to, like my generation, daughters, were all married to Armenian-speaking Armenians coming from Iran or from Armenia, and were fully Armenianized, and the fourth generation, their children, are educated in Armenian. So you can have, this is one lengthy remark, and then I have a second one, if I still may, that nationalism requires a concept of ideology that is monolithic and monolingual. French identity is French-speaking, Catholic, German, only German, monolingual German. But then you have these geographical areas, as Transylvania is also one of them, where identity automatically, very naturally, is conceived as plural. So, being a Transylvanian, you are exposed to a variety of languages, cultures, religions. Today, as I said, we walked through Cluj and we saw like a dozen different churches of different denominations. So you are exposed to identity as being defined as multiple. So it is the most natural sense to say, I am German and Armenian and Hungarian and Romanian and in the same person, without having serious psychological problems because of identity crisis. And then there is yet another aspect for Armenian families. Many Armenian survivors of the genocide settled first in colonies like Lebanon, like Syria, like Palestine, like Iran. So the first generation came out of Anatolia and then settled, built up a new life, and then experienced of all, without exception, of these Middle Eastern colonies, again, war and destruction. So Palestinian Armenians who came as genocide survivors, settled in Palestine, in Jerusalem, let's say, had to flee in 1948. Imagine many of these families settled in Lebanon. So the same family, again, in 75, 76, when the war in Lebanon started, many of these families went out and settled, let's say, in France or the United States. So what do you do of this family member? Identity is something that you can accumulate. You come out of Anatolia, and these people, they speak an Anatolian dialect of Turkish or Armenian. Then they come to Palestine, they learn Arabic, and they become Palestinian Armenians or Jerusalemites, and they identify with that over the course of the year. Then they come to settle in Lebanon, and Lebanon also leaves a trace upon them, and they, even if they are not counted Lebanese, let's say, but part of their emotional setup may be now Lebanese. So they will watch the news of Lebanon with a different eye than somebody who has never experienced that society. And then they come in the United States and they become assimilated or at least integrated, and they would like to identify themselves as American. Why not? Identity is something accumulative and by far not in this monolithic way. So, and then there is this playful handling according to gender, according to biography, whether I put the Armenian as an adjective or in the second or third or fifth place, but maybe not at all in a hierarchical manner of the identities, but rather in this accumulative multitude, which is the normal case throughout the globe, with only the exception of a few Western European countries who imposed the monolithic thinking about identity on, let's say, the rest of the world, which causes a lot of problems and caused a lot of problems. And with this remark I will finish. In the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire was this kind of a plural society with a multitude of identities, including those kind of identities which we would now define as hybrid or mixed. Let's say the Armenian-speaking community of Hamshen. This is a region, Black Sea region in Turkey today, where there is still this community living. There are Armenian speakers, but Muslims. And they were Islamized in the 17th, 18th centuries. So in the Ottoman Empire, their identity was no problem. But on the eve of modernity, they had to decide, what are you? And they could not be this, I am the one and the other, but they should decide for either the one or the other. And this transformation of a multiple of this big empire to a nation state, to the narrow scope of nation state, was one of the very important causes of genocide and the century of destruction, the century of genocide that we experienced during the 20th century, be it the Armenian genocide, being the genocide of the European Jewry and the Roma and Sinti population. That was my lengthy remark. I will never talk so much again.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of the college, I can definitely promise that there will be a second part and follow-ups. Now the dinner is ready. Everybody can put the questions to our guest professors and researchers at the table. I wish you a pleasant evening and good appetite. And tomorrow in Szamosújvár, you should visit Anna Kovács, who is a specialist of Angazsabur.